Hey, what's up you guys, it's Dorothy and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to go into part 2 of chapter 7 of 4 Perfect Pebbles by Lila Pearl and Marion Blumenthal-Lizanne. So let's get right into this video. This video is going to contain sensitive topics and foul language. If you do not wish to continue, I suggest you click off the video now. You have been warned. Papa was in very poor health by this time, and my leg was still raw and open wound. After huddling together on the train for 2 weeks, we feared the slightest separation. We wanted to stay as close to each other as my 4 perfect pebbles, the little stones that I could hold in the palm of my hand. After the Russian liberators of the death train moved on, other Russian units arrived in Tropaz to secure the conquered region for the formal occupation forces that were to follow. The military too foraged in the village and the surrounding countryside for food and other supplies, for they were often poorly equipped. In their crude way though, Marion said, the Russians tried to help us as best they could. They were extremely good to me, for each day they transported me to a nearby Russian army field hospital where they treated my leg. First they would clean the wound, and then they would sprinkle it with a greenish-yellow powder. Mama and I believed that this powder was a form of penicillin, a miracle drug for infections that had been discovered before the war. As the first weeks in Trebets went by, we noticed that new skin was beginning to form around the large burned area on my wound. Mama and I were sure that the nourishing diet, including milk, eggs, and meat, that I was now eating was also helping my body to renew itself. But there was little that could be done to help my nightmares go away. Every day at the hospital I heard the cries and pain of both soldiers and civilians who had been maimed in the war. Worst of all, I saw the ugly stumps of amputees. It was only then that I allowed myself to realize how close I'd come to having my own leg amputated. These terrors haunted my nights in the farmhouse. I'm sure that was one reason why we remained sleeping in the one room. Despite their newfound freedom, the Trebets refugees continued to suffer a serious threat to their lives. Of the 2,500 prisoners who had boarded the death train in Bergen-Belsen, several hundred had died of typhus before reaching Trebets. Some, delirious with fever, unaware of their surroundings, had been carried from the train to the village in handcarts. In the first weeks of Trebets, new cases began to break out, and the refugees realized that the germ-bearing lice were still with them. Many whom had not already shaved their heads did so in order to deprive the lice of a place to hide and breed, and Marion at last allowed Mama to shave hers. The dead were now being buried in common graves known as telescope graves on the outskirts of the village. These burial pits were so named because they could be expanded according to need. Each time a body was added, the soil to cover it was dug from the ground directly beside it, creating a new hollow for the next body. On May 7, 1945, the villagers learned from the radio of Germany's surrenderer that the war in Europe was at an end. Rejoicing was mixed with concern, however, for the Russian occupation forces now informed the refugees that they would have to remain in Trebets until the typhus epidemic had abated. A quarantine period of roughly 2 months was imposed. During that time, none of the former prisoners would be allowed to leave Germany. We tried to settle down to some kind of life in that place, Marion said. As the food that had remained in the farmhouse was consumed, people began to go on foot or by bicycle to quite distant farms and villages to beg, borrow, or trade in order to keep their families nourished. My brother Albert was an expert at this. He was always off somewhere scrounging for food and other necessities. In many ways, although only 12.5 years old, he was becoming the provider of our family. Ever since the journey of the death train, Papa's health had worsened. Before our life in the camps, Papa was a proud and disciplined man, always very exciting and in control of every situation. During Bergen-Belsen especially, it must have hurt him terribly to watch his family suffer and to be unable to help us. Once he had been a heroic defender of his country and respected businessman, as well as a loving and caring husband and father, but the Nazi system had broken him down and robbed him of his self-esteem. Yet he continued to have hope, always carrying with him the German-English dictionary from which he studied, for he still planned that one day we would go to America. As spring came, the Trebets countryside, freshly grown vegetables began to be available, and the food supply improved. The month of May also saw a decline in the number of typhus deaths. At last the disease seemed to have run its course, and the refugees began to look forward to returning to their home countries. For the Blumenthals' reputation would mean a return to Holland. But suddenly, as May warmed into June, the number of typhus cases began to mount again, and this time Marion said Papa was one of its victims. Just as the Germans had tried to kill us in their own last moments, so this last gasp of typhus epidemic would not let Papa go. For days he lay in the farmhouse bedroom, suffering from the burning fever and stabbing headaches and the weird fantasies and semi-consciousness of the disease. And then one morning Albert went to his bedside and saw that he was dead. I think think we were all numb with shock of Papa's death. We had come so far through flight, imprisonment, evacuation, the Nazis' final attempt to destroy us, liberation at last, and now this, freedom and sorrow. Mama, too, had been stricken with typhus and was in the early weak stage of recovery. My leg was still in need of treatment, and I could not walk without difficulty, so the task of burying Papa was left to Albert. By this time, the telescope graves had been replaced by single graves dug in a row just outside the wall of the Turbets village cemetery. There was no possibility of obtaining a coffin for Papa's body. Albert simply wrapped him in the bedsheet on which he'd lain when he died. This became his shroud. Then, with the help of 2 former prisoners who had been on the train with us, my brother placed Papa's body onto a wheeled cart with 2 handles in front and 2 in back. The men helped him to trundle the cart to the cemetery. There, Albert dug a shallow grave, perhaps 4 or 5 feet deep. He placed Papa's body in the earth covered and laid bricks all around it, end to end, to mark the site. The date of Papa's death was June 17th, 1945. June 7th, 1945. One day after Walter Bloom III was buried, the Trebets residents were notified abruptly that their quarantine period had come to an end. They were given 2 hours to gather their belongings and board the column of trucks that awaited them. They were about to begin the first stage of reparation to their former homelands. Although the Bloomfields were not Dutch citizens, their refugee status would take them back to Holland, the country to which they had fled after leaving Germany. Somehow Mama and Marion were helped onto the back of one of the open trucks. Albert was to join them, but as usual, he was out somewhere gathering a supply of food for the journey. As the time for departure came closer, Mama wrung her hands in despair. What if something had now befallen Albert? Where was he? At the very last moment, he came running with his knapsack full, and he clambered aboard. Hands reached out to steady him, but suddenly the truck lurched forward. The jolt loosened Albert's grip on the heavy knapsack, and it flew off his shoulders and bounced onto the road. There it lay in a receding cloud of dust as the truck picked up speed. So, Marion said, Albert lost his treasured knapsack, which he had with him since Westerbork, but this was nothing compared with what we had so many others were leaving behind. There in the Trebet cemetery lay well over 100 dead, plus hundreds more in the mass graves on the outskirts of the town and bedside the railroad embankment. All told, at least 600 people, 1/4 of the 2,500 prisoners who had boarded the death train in Bergen-Belsen, had perished from the disease or exhaustion. That is the end of chapter 7. I will see you guys in the next video for the next chapter. Bye.